Right, so we've touched a bit on the initial built environment. We've talked a little bit about the ecological aspects and some of the major impacts that the growth of Panama City, development of Panama City has had. So now I want to sort of start intermixing the interest in the environmental, the ecological, with that of social justice, which hopefully you'll recall is one of the primary interests of the idea of political ecology. So how does the sort of the decision making around resources, which is encapsulated by politics, relate to the ecological sphere? Now I want to go back again to my 1570 ordinances, and I'd just like you to have a bit of a look at those yourself. Now, if you're anything like me, when you read those for the first time, you might be a little bit surprised, because these were the ordinances again given to Spanish colonizers with regards to instructions as to how they were supposed to set up the sort of the king's city in the colony. Um, and I think it's again at this point where we have to start reflecting on some of the blunter and less nuanced narratives and understandings we have about what was going on at the time of colonial enterprises. Now, being more nuanced about our understanding doesn't have to detract from our normative evaluation that these processes resulted in many undesirable outcomes for a lot of people. But I think what we do need to do is to realise that it's very likely that the motives of individual people involved were very mixed, and it wasn't just about sort of the forced plunder of resources. Imperialism and colonialism had this overlaying element of doing good, and I think in many cases a genuine aspiration by those people, maybe not in the context, to relate to newly discovered peoples, let's say, across the world, and in a socially positive way. Although, of course, as the last paragraph suggests, one that makes sure that the ultimate outcome recognises that the superior people here are the white Europeans, and it's their way of life and their model of development, their model of sustainable development, that should be taken on as being best. And there's a really important self-reflective lesson in all of this, in my interpretation, and that's that as much as we as individuals or collectively might believe in the sort of the ethical orientation of our actions, humans have a fantastic ability to write the story of their own lives in their heads in a way that paints them as the most positive character. Now, it may be that other people look at those processes and those behaviours and say, actually, you were missing the point, and there was a lot of things that you weren't maybe thinking about or that you ignored. And I would say that there's no reason why that should be any less true of us and our actions today than it was of these Spanish actors back in the 1570s. So I guess what I want to say is there's a quote that I like from a contemporary artist whose name has escaped me, but he says, "Hold your beliefs lightly," and I think that's fantastic advice. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be committed to rigorously developed and philosophically reflective ideas about how you behave positively in the world, but you must always hold those beliefs lightly, as rigorous as they might be, because there's always some significant chance that you haven't quite got it right. So back to the politicology of the urban space. So I think this is an interesting broad background, but we can see that maybe it's not necessarily the case that behaviours unfolded in this way in the specific context. And in fact, we know that we know that they didn't. And this is a really important story, which I will try to summarize. It's obviously hundreds of years long, but without understanding this, we can't understand some of the present struggles and difficult social dynamics in Panama today. So this is a march. I don't know when this photograph is taken, but what I can read in the placards is that it's saying, Panamanians, you should defend your rights, a call for democracy. Don't play with our democracy. Panama is, I think it's fair to say, contemporary Panama and Panama City is like most of our world, including the University of Warwick, is a deeply racist society. And I think Panama, maybe there's more likely to be overt acts of racism, and racist discourses are maybe sort of more accepted than they might be at our university. But I think both places equally suffer from structural racism that is very, very difficult to manage and deal with. And we can't understand this without understanding the past from where it comes. Now, for those of you who've done history, you might have done colonialism many times. It won't come as a surprise to hear that during the Spanish conquest and the Spanish occupation of Latin America and places like Panama and Panama City, there was a very strong hierarchy of racial power. So the best people in society, those people with the most advantages and that were most highly thought of by themselves, and I think also by other people, because this is why these discourses become so powerful, were the people who were from Spain. They were the pure blood. Then you had the Spanish people who had their families had lived on the continent long enough, so they were Spanish by parenthood, but they were born in Panama, so they didn't quite have the opportunities, immediate social opportunities as the people from Spain. Then we have people of mixed race, and of course, as we see across the world, throughout the world, including at the University of Warwick, those people that struggle most are those people of indigenous and African origin and identity. That in this case in Panama formed a type of sort of categorical underclass. There was very much a hard division between sort of number 4 and upwards. Now, the reason for this population, the originally African population, was because these people were brought in as labour for the various projects. So already by 1575, it's observed that black people are doing all the work, essentially, and the white people are those people who are having a more free and liberal life, supported by this black labour. And this story of black labour runs deep through the history of Panama and the history of Panama City, as I will now talk about. So let's think about urban dynamics a little bit. And let's think about them specifically with reference to a part of Panama City. There was a particular part of the city which you can see on the map is sketched in the yellow shading here. So you'll see this black line. So this is the Panamanian Railroad that was built by the Americans in 1855. So to connect the two coasts, and this is the Panama City Terminal. So this is the area that we're talking about. This area here you can see is the Old Town. So this is the church that we looked at on the map, and this is the plaza. The main plaza is here. With the main road kind of leading out to the sort of hinterland of Panama. Now this area, this yellow cross-hatched area, was a mixture of different things. It was a poorer region, it was cheaper, as in the quotation. This is where slaves, labourers, artisans used to live. But it also had the Panamanian Railroad terminal, and that made it potentially quite high value land. But which was at the moment getting used by people who had less financial resources, including there was a boarding house. Now Independent analysis suggests that basically anyone who had enough resources wouldn't be living anywhere near any of this. They would be out of the town to get away from the heat and the sort of the oppressive environment. But what we do know from historical accounts is that in the 1850s, because of the presence of the railroad and the identification of this land as being valuable, people started to make investments to buy houses, and the railroad company itself started to develop to use more land. Now, this starts to drive up the price of the land and the cost of those housing. So we can see in the quotation on the left, some individual people managed to make pretty fantastic investment returns, investing 1,000 pesos and selling it, 500 pesos and selling it not too much later for 10,000 pesos. Now, irrespective of the purchasing capacity of a peso at the time, which I think was reasonable, that's a pretty significant percentage return. And this illustrates the way that as the city starts to develop its various functions and a marketized economy starts to sweep in, we get a process that we might identify here as gentrification, that poorer and people with lower capacities get forced out of the communities in which they traditionally live because people see investment opportunities. And the reason that this process comes to light in this article by Daly, written in 1990, is that this whole event actually culminates in a riot and a full-on fight. There is people getting shot, and a cannon is fired at some point, and it's known as the melon riots. So named because it started with an American citizen buying a melon from a local Panamanian, insulting him, and basically what happened is the whole weight of the system took over these individuals, who then started to fight, not because about the price of a melon, but because of the deep structural racial tensions that existed in this society, but which were a result of the physical layout, planning, and the political economy / ecology of the city. Now, to build on this point, it's important to understand, I think, as I've mentioned before, so vast amounts of labour that came to build the railroad and then to build the canal came from what we might know as the West Indies, so as illustrated on the map here. Now, the figures for this are many and varied, but I think it's the Panama Canal Museum suggests we're talking about 44,000 West Indian individuals came in to work on the canal at various stages. And so this gave Panama a population of about 44,000 West Indians and only 6,000 Americans. But yet the tension arises from the fact that the white American minority have the most control, the most power and privilege, compared with the West Indian labourers who are doing most of the work. And this, if you know anything about the politics of the United States of America around the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, this is captured, and this is a quotation taken from a source that I've read. This is not my words. This creates what contemporary white Americans referred to as the color problem at Panama. Color, of course, referring to the way of describing the West Indian community that lived there. Here we have a discourse that's establishing the presence of West Indian individuals with health problems that were mainly borne by that population themselves, but also an expressed concern of there being too many coloured people in this part of the world. Now, it's identified here in the same source that the death rate of West Indians working is a lot higher than the white employees. So it's ranging from 40 to 118% higher than in white employees. And even though this discourse is essentially incredibly incredibly racist, it points out that the reason is because white people have a lot of privileged advantages specifically in terms of the environment, the urban environment in which they live, and the types of employment they perform. And I want to unpack that story to help understand the urban ecology of the city. Now I've got here two stamps that portray very different accounts of the same thing. So on the left-hand side, we have a Panamanian stamp, which ultimately starts to commemorate the role of the West Indian labour force that built the Panama Canal. The use of the word commemorate is interesting because we commemorate people that have died and that have suffered. This is not a celebration of the achievements of, this is commemoration of, which I think is an interesting discourse to be establishing. These are sort of, to me, this speaks of the idea of these being lesser people who we should feel sorry for because they died, rather than anything else. Now, while that might be true, I think if we contrast it to the other stamp, so the US postage stamp, which is celebrating the success, again, the success of the building of the Panama Canal, but in a much more positive way. So the idea that Teddy Roosevelt, the president, was strong enough to have and clever enough to have built the canal where the French failed. He's not getting commemorated. He's getting celebrated. The West Indian workers are not getting celebrated, they're getting commemorated, which I think is interesting, and particularly when we start to look at it in the light of greater detail. So hopefully you will have already been reading this quotation in the bottom right. This hits at the idea that West Indian workers, there was a racial process of racial segregation, but it wasn't so explicit as it originally was in many parts of the United States. West Indian workers were designated as silver employees, and this arose from the fact that they were paid in silver, and that was contrasted to white employees who were paid in gold. And the economic value of the way we understand those two precious metals relates to the way that their labour was valued. This also speaks of the connections between the system of racial segregation in the United States and the way that it was implemented in the building of the Panama Canal, and the then lived experience of the city as it operated with these people involved in the system. So basically, white people having good supervisory jobs that are very well paid, and black people having more manual labour jobs that are lower skilled, and therefore justifying getting paid less. But this division between gold and silver went a lot deeper. So let's now look at the urban fabric to see how these social ideas are played out, how these social constructs, legal constructs, racial constructs play out in the urban fabric. So this is a photograph of work designated for gold roll workers, so white Americans. Pretty fancy looking places. And you can see from the quotation that this was the general style of house built for gold roll workers, both on the Panama Canal territory itself, but also where housing spilled outside of that into Panama City proper. You'll remember the line comes down to divide the US jurisdiction from the actual space country of Panama. These were the style of houses that were built. Look pretty nice. This is a top-down plan of what those buildings look like inside. So here we have generous living space, a dining room. There's a separate kitchen. You'll notice in the top right-hand side there's a specific quarter for servants. Now the servants would have not been white; they would have been black West Indian individuals. They wouldn't have been indigenous Panamanians because they wouldn't have spoken English. And of course, they were firmly at the bottom, nowhere near this place. All the way around the side, big open verandas. So again, wind and air and ventilation can get in to cool open spaces where we haven't got the problems of mosquitoes and malaria and this type of thing. Now, this is a postcard of accommodation which is described as being from Silver City. And for anyone who can have a bit of a translate of the Spanish at the top of this, so these are the residences of coloured employees of the Panama Canal Zone. And this postcard makes things look kind of similar, doesn't it? those houses look very similar indeed. However, if we look at a plan of what's in those houses, we realise that that's actually not, those aren't one individual family house, although it looks like it from the front. Here, that building actually houses 4 individual families. So not so many, definitely not so many rooms, not multiple floors, but much smaller spaces. Storage space, you'll notice outside is lockers, as was the cooking space. There's no accommodation for servants here for these 4 families that are sharing this one house together as Silver Roll employees, as Black West Indians. We can look at academic analysis of the time. So here's a photo of a similar building with even greater concentration of families living in one building, and we can read the quotation that these places were considered to be horrible. They were barrack-style houses where multiple families would live. I'm not sure this quotation necessarily relates to the picture that I've found, but you can hopefully appreciate the point that this is a lot less desirable living conditions than were given to the gold roll white employees. Sociological analysis of this that was done suggests that, as I mentioned, there was accommodation both on the canal zone and off the canal zone. And the sociological analysis suggests that the conditions for particularly West Indian workers living outside the canal zone was even worse. And in fact, while this situation was a privilege for a West Indian worker, because where you became unwell, or you became injured or hurt, or you became too old, you no longer had access to this standard of housing. So you were forced off the canal zone territory into Panama City itself to find private rented or bought accommodation. And the sociological analysis is suggesting that essentially the canal zone is offloading, dumping its old and unwanted human labour into the wider society, where conditions are even worse and more impoverished. Now, accommodation was also provided for individual workers, so those who didn't come with their families might be staying in facilities like this. So this is for Silver Roll workers. You can see that individual bunks here fold down with storage space for their things up in the top. So this was all included as part of the terms and conditions, let's say, of working on the canal. This room looks quite different. I wonder if you might just have a think. Who do you think gets to live here? Now, this is the accommodation of, again, a single individual person, but these are accommodation for white workers without families. This is a top-down plan. So instead of living in one room with, I don't know how many bunk beds were in there, we're talking about individual rooms, again, surrounded by a veranda with an external WC. So here we've got 4 people sharing a toilet, a shower, and a lavatory facility. So obviously the contrast is pretty stark between how the way that the urban fabric is built to accommodate for people with different racial identities. Now, I mentioned back a little bit that sanitation and health and public health is always an important aspect of urban development, no matter what period of history we are looking at. And I just want to take a number of quotes, admittedly taken from all the same article, but I wanted to share these because I think it tells a really important story. And the language here is fascinating. So for alien, which was a descriptive term for foreign, but obviously has a certain value-laden element. So for alien coloured employees, there is not now, nor has there ever been, nearly enough quarters to meet demand. And that was a statement made in 1926 by the canal governor himself, so the American in charge of the US canal zone. So it's not to say that's an issue that wasn't recognised and people tried to address, but if he is admitting this reality, then we have to take it as being fairly accurate. So we know that West Indian families lived in cramped conditions. But here again, the governor is pointing out that sanitation systems were inadequate. And the disease rate, especially from tuberculosis and a myriad of other health concerns, were very, very high. And this helps explain why it was that the death rate of silver workers was much greater than white workers. This is now independent academic analysis, but it's demonstrating that the forces, the market forces that then come to control and to dictate how land is used around the canal zone within Panama City is based upon a profit-seeking element. So white and privileged property owners renting to less privileged black tenants. The quality is getting traded off here for economic advantage. Now, this is if you're interested in reading a novel or some literature, fiction that might relate to this. The book by Waldron is interesting, and I've bought myself a copy. So this is a fictional description of what it was like to live in Panama City as a West Indian worker at the time. But I think there's sufficient evidence that this is an effective encapsulation of the conditions of living for the silver roll workers. Just to go a little bit further, and just to cover this off. So as the quotation here suggests, yes, there were differences in the houses that were provided for silver and gold roll workers. And we might say, well, actually, that's okay, isn't it? Because the silver roll workers were less skilled, so they should get paid less because it's easier to access. That's how markets work. Markets are an effective way to organize the distribution of resources in lots of ways. That's fair. But then when we start to realize this wasn't just about differences in qualities of individual buildings, this was about the way that the whole urban space was zoned in a way that created places for privileged white people that were different to privileged black people. Less privileged black people. This is racial segregation embedded into the physical fabric of the city in exactly the same way that it is in countries that have formal apartheid and formal racial segregation, like used to be the case in the United States of America. So we have this idea of silver cities, and that means they're cities for black people. And here we have a map. So this isn't Panama City. Silver City, this particular urban project was on the other coast, but I don't think that's that important. What's important is to recognize that this was a formally established and zoned system of racial segregation in Panama City. It also goes beyond houses. So we can look at the quote here. And I think this connects nicely with our current reality in Europe and again, I'll say at the University of Warwick. So this is not about overt racism. This is not about the use of racially offensive words in open public and the specific notices that say no black people allowed because we think that they're of lesser quality. But the same divisive structures get re-embedded and recoded in other discourses and the physical space. And you can see this borne out in the quotation here. So distinctions between the schools that students went to, the places that you could go to shop, the types of bar and the bars that you were allowed to mix and socialize. There was separate washrooms and drinking fountains, not because it said white and Negro, but because it said silver and it said gold. And this was justified through this lens of productivity and silver and gold pay. You can probably glean from that little presentation that this was maybe not the most racially harmonious city in the world as it was developing through the building and then operation of the Panama Canal. And again, just to go back to the way that these processes interact and become embedded in bigger processes. So yes, many landlords push for exploitation by increasing rent to extract more profits. But we have fascinating accounts here of where tensions increase. There is agitation and resistance by the black community against the white propertied class of Americans and of mestizos, etc. To the point at which there is open riot and protest. And this is quite incredible to imagine. The way that this is dealt with is not through civil law, but is through calling in the army to forcibly put down the open civil disobedience. And we hopefully were fairly shocked to look to the United States of America recently and to see President Trump calling in the National Guard and federal forces into cities where he deemed that governors were unable to deal with the challenging behaviours of black communities protesting about structural racism and oppressive situations. Here we see a direct parallel, except this is back in a time, the 1930s, when in my head it's kind of acceptable. But maybe people didn't quite understand. But I think this goes to show that very little has changed, really, when we're honest with ourselves and we're honest about the way that we live our lives. Now, this is just something that I find absolutely fascinating. It's probably fairly tangential to the story of Panama City. Well, no, it's not. It's fundamental, but you may or may not be interested. So in the US, because of its legal right to intervene and protect, initially the railroad that it built, and then of course the creation of the canal, it was essentially US sovereign territory. It always had the right of military intervention to deal with security issues. The US military has intervened in Panama an awful lot, tens of times at least. And I was personally very shocked to realize that there was a significant invasion of US forces as recently as 1989. So just as the sort of agreement on global sustainable development was getting codified, the US was invading Panama to propagate its influence and essentially to put down a movement of national response that said, we're fed up of getting told what to do by the Americans, and we're going to do what we want. And the invasion was under the pretense of protecting the people and getting rid of problematic local politicians who were corrupt by drug money. That was potentially not necessarily untrue, but I think the motivations were very different to the way they were expressed. If you're interested, there's a film that I will put on Moodle, which gives a very interesting account. It has its problems. I'm sure it's not 100% fact, but it's very interesting. And the point, just to come back to, is that what we've got here in understanding the political ecology of this city is it's not just about city planning and ordinances. It's not just about socially imposed lenses of racial identity and inequality. It's not just about the building of that in material fabric. It's not just about the codification of that in legal structures. It is the backing of all that by a serious military force. And ultimately, that's how a status quo system holds together. Because if you push it far enough, someone will pick up a stick and try and hit you, or they will call in the police, or as in the case in Panama then and the USA now, they will call in the army and point a gun at you. We like to think we've moved beyond that, but in my opinion, we haven't. That's how it works. So I bet you thought you'd never be doing that in the cities module. This Panama City is so complex and interesting. Got a few more points to talk about. Obviously, if you're feeling a bit tired, do pause the video. But I'm going to carry on and say that talk a bit more about the political economy underlying the political ecology of how resources get used. So another thing that really pissed off the Panamanians is that the canal zone, or the railway initially, and then the canal zone was its own separate economy. So everything that was needed in the canal zone was sourced by the Canal Authority. Yes, some of it was brought in from outside and sourced from Panama, but an awful lot of it was shipped in from the United States. It was an extension, it was an overseas colony, essentially, of the US, and they were using this to their economic advantage, both to facilitate global trade, but also to keep the whole thing running. So they were specific places. Basically, if you lived in the Canal Zone, you could buy everything you needed from the Canal Zone Authority. So you didn't need to go out and inject any money into the wider Panamanian economy. So you can see here examples. People were given coupon books, so it was a monetary substitute. You could use this in the special shops that would keep the money within the Canal Zone system, not allow it to leak out into Panama. So that was the case with the railroad from 1850 onwards, and that was the case with the U.S. Canal that existed up until very recently. Now, I think this is really interesting. This is not urban economy. This should be in the food module. But here, so this is a picture of one of the Canal Zone outlets, and I love the fact here. This as if having an entire economic monopoly over the sale of food wasn't enough. They had to add the discursive weight. This is pure food, and it's properly kept. And to me, that implies, in contrast to that substandard food that you can buy outside the Canal Zone from those other people that don't look like us. I think there is a significant one little label on a fridge. I think can tell you a lot more than if you take it at face value. And indeed, it's just come to mind that I want to say this is exactly the sort of way you should be trying to use photographs in your photo essay. So I wouldn't put this in my photo essay and say, here is a picture of a shop. The Canal Zone had its own shops. I would be looking at every single detail of this. Are those pineapples? Where are they from? That's probably a local product. Okay. What else have we got in here? What products might not be from Panama? And I can have a different picture then with all the durable food products, the canned products that came from the USA, and I could zoom in on that text, and I could analyze that and make my argument much more intricate, deeper, much more intellectually sophisticated. So that's what I want you to be pushing for. But obviously, what we could also then write about is how this created tensions with the wider Panamanian, the local Panamanian national community, this controlled political economy. And I encourage you, wherever you read political economy, think about political ecology, because this is food. Those pineapples are off pineapple trees. That is an environmental resource. That is nutrients. That is water flowing through the economy in a certain way and being used by the city in a certain way. People are included, excluded. People benefit. Other people benefit less. That is what we find in political ecology. So I now want to tell you a little bit about more recent history. So in 1999, it had been agreed, so the Panamanians had been struggling to take back control of the Panama Canal for decades. In 1999, a prior agreement was finally realized, and control passed from the US jurisdiction. It gave back the territory. It was no longer sovereign US territory. It was part of Panama again, and the Panama Canal was administered by the newly constituted Panama Canal Authority. Largely probably the same people involved from the Panamanian side, still obviously a center of power and control and resources, but nevertheless it was nationalized to great Panamanian celebrations after years of agitating and violence and complaint and US invasions. And this had consequences for the urban fabric of the city. So these two stories again are intimately connected. So all the housing from the Canal Zone then gets passed back into the wider market, into the country. And we're going to have a little break there, and then the next section is going to talk about the consequences of that, and then therefore the contemporary, and my account of the contemporary political ecology of the city.